Welcome back to the Coming Together podcast, Interrelationships of Evolutionary Astrology Teachings. And this is Bradley Naragon. And I'm super excited today have guest Jordyn Smith with us. Welcome, Jordyn.
Hello.
And today we decided we were going to have a little conversation. I guess we're calling it Pluto and the pandemic right now. Um, but before we get into that, um, Jordyn, you are an evolutionary astrologer, is that correct?
Yes.
And you also studied the Jeffrey Wolf Green Evolutionary Astrology. That's true, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you do readings, right?
Yes. I do
Yes.
readings. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have quite a bit out there too. I mean, I've definitely seen other videos and things that you've been on. So,
Yeah.
um, and you have a website also.
Yeah. I have a website and a YouTube channel, and they're both called Nonconformist Conscience. So you can find
Okay.
YouTube or my website. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah. But it's like conscience, like, a guilty conscience, not like consciousness. So yeah.
Got it. Okay. I can put that in the notes for people.
Okay.
Make it easy to find you if you haven't checked out Jordyn, um, and you want to, please do. Yeah. Yeah, I'm super excited to have you here. And so, yeah, the initial idea of this one is, just like getting a little bit into the psychology of what happened during the pandemic based on the Pluto generations. But also there are some larger themes here. And I was telling Jordyn, this is a surprise for Jordyn here. I drew one tarot card before this, just like I wasn't really thinking, but I just drew a card. And then it's the Seven of Wands. And it's an interesting card. And after I read it, I realized that it was speaking to the pandemic dynamic a little bit. And the Seven of Wands is a really interesting card in the sense that it has this lesson of there's this there's a conflict going on, like as there often is with the wands, but the person's kind of staying on top of what life is bringing them, and so it gives a sense of um, like it gives like a little bit of a purpose and adrenaline and excitement because there's just like more of an engagement of life of like, okay, this is happening, I gotta like do this next thing. And I thought that was a really interesting concept. One of my first experiences with the pandemic was working at a grocery store, and one of my coworkers who was like, um, I guess I saw him as being really disengaged and disconnected from meaning in life and society entirely. Like honestly, like it was kind of like you need like a change, but I'm not gonna say that to you, but like just like going through the motions of life. And when the pandemic started, it was just like there was some newfound meaning or purpose in life. Really interesting concept. And obviously, there's such varied experiences that are so vast for each individual, like, during it and not, and it changed. So, but that is kind of an interesting thought and concept and I wanted to kind of tie that back in when we get into Pluto generations, because there's this piece about, like our souls incarnate and we have a purpose, right? And we want to do what our soul wants to do, our soul purpose. And so I do kind of, it's kind of this question of like, how much for the pandemic did it bring out for different souls, like their purpose? How much did it become some fuel for this soul fire? Um, Something to think about.
That totally resonates. Like me just even reflecting on, so I mean, can I talk about myself for a second? I don't know if that's
Please, yes, that would
okay.
be great.
So
Yeah.
I think like even for me personally, I had I'm 35 now, but I had just gone through my Saturn return, And it was during the pandemic that I started studying evolutionary astrology, like full on hermit in my office, just completely osmosing whatever I could. And it was because I felt like it was my purpose. It was like the first time that I felt like astrology really clicked for me. And it also put like a fire under my ass, because I did want to do something that was purpose driven, especially whenever I saw kind of it felt like the world was burning down.
Hmm.
So I think that you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
I said it right this
Yeah,
time, right?
yeah, yeah. Wow, for some reason I thought in my head that you'd been studying a lot longer. You obviously like, yeah. Wow,
Yeah,
amazing. Cool. Thanks for sharing that.
no problem.
So yeah, it took a minute for then that, with that drawing that card, and then it kind of hit me that there's this other story there, with, and another part of that, the symbolism of that card is it's like it's kind of like you're in the fight and you're keeping up, like for now, like if you follow the suit of wands through its journey, at some point there's kind of like you can't keep fighting story that emerges. But with the seven, there's this like I'm keeping up. So that's interesting. But
That
um,
is interesting. I love that.
so one of the things that we had a couple larger themes and thoughts today was, well, one is, like what does each Pluto generation, what was their response to the pandemic? Definitely want to get into that. Um, and I guess I would say there's, well, one, obviously, like Pluto is in Capricorn for most of the heart of the pandemic when we say pandemic. And, obviously, it could be like, well, it's still going on. And like on some ways, that's true too. But there was this kind of core experience there for a couple years. I think that's what people refer to. Um, but Pluto in Capricorn, it had been in Capricorn a long time. So there's this piece of like, well, what does Pluto and Capricorn mean for each of the Pluto generations that are on the planet now in general? And then when the pandemic came, like, how did that like intensify that process?
Mhm.
So that's one concept. And if you study evolutionary astrology, you're probably familiar that um, we have a lot of Pluto generations on the planet, but Pluto's transiting speed changes really dramatically. So like Pluto goes fastest through the sign of Scorpio. I always thought this so interesting. It goes fastest through the sign of Scorpio. So when you have like the Pluto Leo, Pluto Virgo, Pluto Libra, Pluto Scorpio, and then on like this is like that one time where like that half of the zodiac gives us six different Pluto generations on the planet. Um,
Yeah.
And then, like when Pluto's in Taurus, it's going really slow, like really slow. Like you could have three generations and they're all Pluto Taurus, right?
Mhm.
um, but then it's interesting because the polarity is the evolutionary point, evolutionary astrology. So there's this whole thing of, even though there's this smaller Pluto Scorpio generation, they're all evolving through the Taurus polarity, which um, and Pluto, it's like kind of like Pluto moving fast through Scorpio, like that generation is like, I don't know, like are they like, let's go, let's do this, just like so like driven to evolve, and then is the polarity this like, okay, yeah, but like let's like slow down and ground this process, like
Yeah. It's like the need to simplify for sure is how I feel about that. Like, especially whenever it becomes like super psychological because of all of the external, it's like good to go into that polarity because it's like grounding and it helps to figure out what do I need to simplify to make life not so chaotic.
hmm yeah.
Yeah.
um like another thought on the Pluto generations was this piece of like, because Pluto has been moving faster, like a lot of people have like grown up, and then Pluto's been in the next sign. And this is something I was sharing with you I think earlier when we were messaging, was this whole idea of like, it's like we have the polarities and the signs, and like the polarities are like opposites, so to speak, but then like whatever the next sign is in the zodiac is like such a dramatic energetic shift and difference from the previous sign that like, I mean they're not opposites, but they're kind of like so different in a way. So this idea that so like just going into like the Pluto Sag generation, like all of these Pluto Sages grew up with Pluto and Capricorn, which is like really different, you know? So
Mhm.
I guess like, you know, like one of the common things I think about the Pluto Sages is they're really going to reform education, you know, at some
Yeah.
point here. And the Pluto Capricorn era, at least in the United States, and has been like standardization, standardization, more standardization,
Hmm.
and it's not really natural. And it's like all of this like conformity and control um, and the Pluto, and so like when we get into this whole idea of like that Pluto Sag generation within the pandemic, it's pretty interesting because it was like then they had even more limitation on their experience of life and reality. And I just think of like Pluto Sag and that fire to just, you know, go and explore and to live freely. And the conditions of the pandemic are so opposite the nature of what their souls wanted to do. um, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I before we did this, I was like wanting to understand. I was like, I had this thought of because I actually recalled what you said about this. But I was thinking like, what is like the average mean age that souls have like so I came in with Pluto and Scorpio and then it changed to Pluto and Sag, you know, and then but it's the mean age is around like the coming of ages, if that makes sense, that whenever this shift happens, and those are like the pivotal ages of learning how to socialize and how to, so even the like the psychological factor of that, you know, like you were saying Pluto and Sag, they dealt with during, you know, their coming of age, it became Pluto and Capricorn. So it was very stark and different. And, you know, it's like where do you go from there whenever you're, you know, a tween to early teenager or whatever, whenever that shift is happening? How does that impact you on a social level? Because that is what coming of age really is. It's like learning how to be within society. So it made me think about you know how whenever the Pluto shifts signs, um, how it has this impact on what we feel like is our social role, you know, because we
Mm.
get that imprint of the next sign. So I thought that that was fascinating, and it was kind of a segue off of what you were talking about. And it'll be interesting because Pluto and Aquarius will not have to deal with that, you know.
That's really
Fascinating.
interesting. Yeah, because and for our listeners, I mean that to me that really brings up this concept of there's this progression through the zodiac. There's a need to go into the next archetype of the next sign as you carry on with the journey. You know, like so like from Sagittarius, from what our own knowing, our own truth, our own beliefs are, like then that kind of like there's this natural progression into Capricorn where then that begins to define our reality.
Yes.
um,
Well,
yeah,
and I
I
was, oh, sorry, go
oh
ahead.
go ahead.
Well, I was thinking of like even Pluto Sag. So you had, you know, Greta Thunberg, who in her formative years, Pluto went into Capricorn. So like I feel like that's even, and then even to look at how the pandemic impacted what she was trying to do as well, you know. Um, I think that that's like a more tangible way to kind of view
Mm,
that. You know what I'm saying? So like how did that you can see like the trajectory of when she started doing her work, and like doing her protest and all of these things, that was in her formative years when Pluto was had entered into Capricorn. So I think it's fascinating to look at that.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, right. So, I mean, that was like social responsibility was what popped in my head when you were saying that of like growing
Mm,
up in this time period where it's like, yeah, we need accountability. We need to be responsible stewards for the earth, the resources to each other, um, and having that imprint in those years.
yeah.
And that having that generation be a lot of the Pluto Sages who are very much driven by what's their truth is. So
Yeah.
like to combine those things to then be like, okay, then that truth naturally goes into a social responsibility action.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah, I
interesting.
actually like pulled a headline of hers, and it was during the pandemic. There was a National Geographic article, and it said living through multiple crises in a post-truth society. And this was like about Greta Thunberg. And I was like, oh wow, like that is perfect for
Hmm.
her generation and her own soul's evolution and what she was speaking to during the pandemic with what we're talking about, having Pluto entered Capricorn during her formative years. So yeah, I mean, totally on par, I feel like, for a Pluto and Sag.
Pluto and Sag too can have such a great expansive vision of what's possible. And then the Pluto Capricorn period is like, this is actually the reality. Guess what? Like,
Yeah.
like this
Yeah.
is what we're dealing with. Now what? Oh.
Hmm. And all of a sudden you have the restriction coming in or feeling restricted.
There was kind of near the end of the pandemic, one of the first big events. I went with both of my Pluto Sag children to see The Weekend in Seattle, and it was packed. I mean, there was like, I don't know how many thousands of people were in that space, and but I was like, this is the Pluto Sag generation. Like they clearly they don't care. Like they're
Yeah.
just like so excited to be here.
Hmm.
um, so it's interesting to see. I guess I've kind of seen. Let me know what you think on this. So I really appreciated um, that example that you brought in, and so there are the souls who um, respond more seriously to this social responsibility, and then also I think within the Pluto Sag generation, there's this um, really strong desire to just like live their lives.
Hmm.
Um, and in that capacity, the fire signs can be a bit, like I guess like self-centered in a way of like, yeah, I don't care. I still I want that thing and I want to have that life that I've seen for myself too. So like I'm gonna go get that and go do this.
Hmm.
Um, and then having the restriction of the pandemic limit even more of like, no, you can't even go hang out with your friends. Like you can't even have a regular um, teenage like experience here.
Easy.
Um, but
Childhood.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was thinking about this kind of to segue off of that was my kiddos are Pluto and Capricorn, and my oldest, they were born in 2009. Excuse me. Oh my gosh. Um, so whenever the pandemic hit, it was when they were in middle school. And that's like this pivotal time period of learning how to socially, it's like the bridge, of how do I socially interact. Elementary is, pretty much super subjective. And then whenever you're, going to high school, it's becoming more objective. You're learning how to deal with social kind of cliques, or it's teaching you about how society works. But a lot of the kids in the Pluto Capricorn generation and some of them in the Pluto Sag completely didn't have this social aspect of being able to learn how to do that. So you see how it's like impacted Gen Z, I guess, the most, I feel like, probably. um with their, their social skills, or you saw like high rates of depression with a lot of them because, they were not getting the education that they needed during this time. So I found that was, you know, um, I was trying to look up statistics on all of this. Anyway, I need to
Hmm.
cough again, so continue.
Okay, okay.
Sorry.
Um, right. Yeah, that's really interesting to think about that generation. And one of the things that popped in my head while you were talking was, like obviously Pluto spends a third of the year retrograde. So in evolutionary astrology, we always have this concept, and then you've also got, like a third of the population that's individuating. So even though like a Pluto Capricorn signature can represent a lot of souls that do have this intention to evolve by the rules of the society they're born into, you always have this, third of them or so percentage of them that have to kind of rebel and find their own
Yeah.
path, and like it doesn't resonate. Like the norm does not resonate for them, even though they have Pluto Cap.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like even seeing this is kind of not necessarily pandemic wise, but a lot of these are like the kids who are coming out as transgendered or non-binary and wanting to, so it speaks to exactly what you're talking about. A lot of them have Pluto and Capricorn, and they're like, no, like the restriction around what gender is, this doesn't feel authentic or real for me, or, all of these things. So they're really challenging the status quo, and they're ultimately, I mean, this, um, with the end, souls that are individuating, it's to help that consensus, to evolve. So I feel like we see a big influx of that right now, you know.
That's, I mean, that's a really interesting conversation too, and obviously we could have a whole conversation about that. And or for our listeners, if in case you don't know, or just to state it clearly, in evolutionary astrology, the Cancer Capricorn as a polarity does correlate to gender assignment,
Mhm.
and that kind of like where we meet those conditioned roles of who we're supposed to be, what that means. And it's interesting because immediately in my mind I go back to Pluto in Cancer generation. And when we go back to the Pluto and Cancer generation growing up, the emotional insecurity of challenging the gender assignments, which were more rigid at that time, and there's still massive consequences for these souls to come out and reject today. But even then, it was less accepted, and so you have this. I mean, most of those souls have passed on, so we don't really have a lot of there's probably some stories, but like it kind of raises those questions of like what was actually going on internally for them if they grew up and they're like, this doesn't fit me, like you're putting me in this box that I don't identify with.
Yeah, I think a lot of them, it's interesting because that was the polarity of that is then Pluto and Capricorn. But so there's this, whenever it's not actualized naturally, I think that's why a lot of them were drinking, right? Like we had like the women who were housewives who were, you know, getting lit, as a way to deal with what was going on. I think that's one of the ways that it manifested.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, opium dens. There was like
All of it,
there was a counterculture.
um it was also like, what was it? Um it was like amphetamines that they were taking, so that they could keep up with the house chores and do all of the duties, and you
Hmm.
saw a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Mhm. Yeah. The Pluto and Caps. I appreciate you bringing in more on the Pluto Capricorns. Um, I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that with pandemic related specifically.
I think, well, it's really interesting. So like the first wave of Pluto and Caps, I'm pretty sure that were born, right? So like 2009, end of 2008. Oh yeah, it was right as Pluto entered Capricorn. The nodes were in Leo Aquarius, with the North Node being Aquarius. So it's going to be really
Mm,
fascinating to see, what this, now that they're in their, coming of age, their formative years, like what's going to happen when that Pluto is transiting over that North Node for them,
mhm,
How is that going to look for them as a way to evolve the collective if they are more in those individuated stages, or what are they trying to liberate from, at any stage? So, yeah, I think that it's fascinating. It's kind of like it's segueing off of this.
yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah, so then to bring it back to the pandemic conditions, if you have that North Node in Aquarius, um, yeah, there's just something that doesn't, like, I think of it as a resonance piece. Is like something doesn't really resonate at all with
Yeah.
what the experience is, and that kind of propels them towards the North Node of how do we think differently about all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of is,
Yes.
it's a lot. I mean, it's a lot for, I'm always amazed at the youth and some of their awarenesses, and a lot of times I'll be like, "You're a level of like emotional intelligence like took me till I was in my 40s, like, or something."
I swear, my oldest is like their emotional intelligence is like a 30-year-old. Like I'm like, how, like, you know, I'm not even gonna go into it, but it's definitely what you're saying. But I also think it's like the Pluto in Capricorn can be like these older souls coming in, right? Like that
Hmm.
have this like
Mm.
Capricornian wisdom from this direct experience from prior lifetimes that they want to use as a social function, as purposeful. It goes back to like the tarot you pulled, like their purposeful work. Like, what is the trajectory for them? What are they absorbing or osmosing Pluto, during this time period of living through these experiences, and how is it shaping them and structuring their reality, and how are they gonna want to utilize what they're, I mean, this could be kind of Pollyanna about me, but it's like I don't think all of them are going to be like this. I don't want to overgeneralize, but it's like I do feel like a lot of them are going to want to do something as a way to help, society and humanity, and to restructure how we live.
Hmm. The Another thought on the Pluto Capricorn is like, I mean, they kind of have, this idea that I've been thinking about with them is like, did they come in and like the pandemic as a symbol of this restrictive reality, so to speak, or more of controlled and protocols, and like, is this also like a relive experience for them? Like they've already, like, talking about them being old souls, they've already kind of lived through some really restrictive experiences. Like, what could those have been? I mean, probably different in a lot of ways, but it it's interesting because like that whole piece of, like, we got 8 billion people on the planet, thinking about resource management and really being responsible for stewards of what we have here. That generation seems to, probably play a key role in leading the way on that.
Mhm.
um, yeah.
Um, well, I mean, do you want to talk about, I mean, I think that this is fascinating, and it kind of goes off of the whole Capricorn piece, but the Pluto and Scorpio generation that has the whole Cap stellium. Like, do you want to speak to that a little bit? Like
Yeah,
about
let's
after the
let's
pandemic?
continue on with the generations. I love this. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had I know you have a lot to say. Should I start us, or do you want to
Yeah,
go
I
first?
want you to start. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I had this crazy thought about the Pluto Scorpios, which was, um okay, like thinking about it in terms of like from Pluto in Scorpio by sign, by the time Pluto got to Capricorn, we have the sextile.
Hmm.
And um I think of the sextile as this kind of Taurian aspect, the waxing sextile. Very Taurian is like to really get a chance to establish oneself, which also, in a way, kind of fits the polarity of Taurus. So, one of my thoughts is like basically like, and this is kind of true for all the generations to me during the pandemic, is like the Pluto Leos were like, like they're like doing their thing, like, like they're like so into their career and their life and their purpose that they just like kept going and going and going. And um, I'm going to jump back, but just to contextualize a piece with that is like, like the Pluto Leos with the Capricorn aspect is an inconjunct, and so this like it's like truly this crisis of age for the Pluto Leo generations hit, and the pandemic amplified that. And so we know like a lot of the Pluto Leos retired, um, had health issues, faced death. So like a lot of the that older generation that was holding these positions of responsibility, power in the social reality, workplaces, jobs, like jobs opened up. So like to kind of go back to the Pluto Scorpios in the sense that like in some ways I was like I feel like they came up and was just like everything was really like tight and hard to get into, and then the pandemic gave them these opportunities to step into positions that gave them resources, that gave them power. And so kind of in this weird way, like for I guess that's kind of my question is like how many of them actually was like finally like I get an opportunity, like there's movement. So it's kind of this weird thing where like one person's loss is another person's gain, and
Yeah.
there was that happening. So that was one thought on the Pluto Scorpio generation, but
I think that a great example of that is AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I think that's how you pronounce her name. That was like the youngest woman who uh, got elected during this time. It was like right around the pandemic. She was born in 1989, I believe. So Pluto Scorpio, So I feel like a great example of exactly what you're talking about.
I didn't know she was 89 Pluto Scorpio. That's interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's it's exactly what you talked about, I feel like. Um, because it was like, I mean, I think for her, um, positions were opening up and she felt like she needed to speak up for, the people and so you can see how um Pluto and conditioning her reality at the time, to really come to her own power.
Had a little freeze up, but
My internet.
caught most of it.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm gonna turn my hotspot on. Um, but could you understand what I said?
I kind
Or
of
do
just
I
got
need
the
to?
tail end. So if you wanna
Um,
reiterate.
I was saying like how we could see how because there were social roles that were leaving, like what you were talking about, it opened it up for her to step into her own power and to do you could see how Pluto and Capricorn was even conditioning her Pluto and Scorpio with that sextile to step into her power.
Hmm.
Uh,
There's with the Pluto Scorpio generation, and then this is also kind of like a larger theme, I guess, to speak to is um, at one point somebody pointed out to me that like co-ops are very scorpionic, and I was like, oh, and then I was like, oh yeah, it does make sense. Like, and for the food co-ops in the United States, like one of the little like, phrases is stronger together. I was like, that
mhm,
is so Scorpio, this combining of resources, and like things like unions and cooperative movements often like don't really get like educated to the public of what's actually happening with them, but coming up as that generation with this awareness of resources being really strong, and in a world where it's like was like in the Pluto Capricorn era became harder to figure out how to get by, then it's this evolutionary force to figure out how to pool resources. Um, so I know in the town that I'm in, I am seeing some co-ops, of with a lot of Pluto Scorpio generation people like formed, and they're doing it, and it's hard. It's hard. It's not like an easy thing, but it's interesting, dynamic. Um, and so that is kind of that larger piece of, obviously the pandemic kind of exacerbated, I don't want to say that, this whole thing of
You said
like
it right, exacerbated.
access to resources, like then like resources not being available, and like kind of shifting that experience a little bit. So it's like, okay, how did that generation respond to this whole thing? um yeah, it's kind of a question of like, did the Pluto Scorpio generation, come together more in ways to, um I guess, weather the storm, so to speak, or was it the opposite, where there's like reclusion and
I I mean, I okay, so what I saw of my generation, and this is just where I live, so let's keep that in mind. Was I told you there was a lot of agoraphobia, like people being afraid to go outside. Some of them are still carrying that. And I also saw a lot more suicide happen in my generation. So it was like if they couldn't be around other
Mhm,
people,
mhm,
or they didn't have that sense of like sharing, or a
mhm.
sense of community during that time, I saw a lot of them. Yeah, I can think of four people off the top of my mind who committed suicide during this time period because it just became too much, for them.
Yeah,
Which I
I
mean, and that's something
mhm,
that suicide is part of Pluto Scorpio,
yeah,
well, Scorpio.
definitely had news of, friends who've had suicides during that time too. Yeah, the whole,
Hmm.
yeah, to, I guess, like right at the most basic level, like the Pluto Scorpio souls, like the desires to be empowered, but then there's like the experience of powerlessness. And
Hmm.
so I think what you're talking to kind of points out that then there's the soul reliving a sense of total powerlessness to
Yeah.
actualize what they came to do.
Mm.
It's pretty sad, heavy stuff. I
Yeah. Sorry.
also, no, I mean, it's really worth getting into for
Yeah.
me. And the
Okay,
other
cool.
part of the Pluto Scorpio signature there is, just for, like you and I probably have this in our heads, but maybe not everyone out there knows this, but a lot of this Pluto Scorpio generation, they have Neptune and Capricorn, and then a good chunk of them also have Uranus in Capricorn, and some of them also have the Saturn in Capricorn. So, just kind of looking at it as, let's just take the Neptune in Capricorn, which is most of the Pluto Scorpios. You already have this kind of theme of potential. I was like, it could be idealization of society, or and whatever that means, or it could be this total disillusionment of society. And so that kind of, it's kind of one of those examples where a sextile like could create an opportunity for something that's maybe like not so great, like there's an
Yeah.
opportunity for something to develop, but like what is that? And like it could be this like greater into the, it's all meaningless, and
It could really set in the futility for sure.
yes,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
I agree
and
with that.
we
Yeah,
saw that. I mean,
yes, we did. And okay, this one is kind of another interesting one that I saw. Was, and this kind of gets into some of the other stuff. I'm just gonna be very Pluto Scorpio right now. But I saw a lot of people in my generation start to explore with their sexuality during this time because it was like they almost felt like they could, right? Because they were by themselves. And so like I saw, I think I have like two friends that started like Facebook groups that were like for body positivity and sexuality, and it kind of blew
Mm.
up. So it became this like time to really like it's this interesting dynamic during this time period that I saw because like the polarity point of Pluto and Scorpio is that Taurus. So like working on self-esteem and all of these, dynamics. And there was social media, which was like one of the only things that people could feel like a sense of community during this time. And so they were figuring out ways to like metamorphose these dynamics and do it in a way that could bring community together, which I thought was really interesting as me just observing it, from the outside. I was like, oh wow. So, I mean, I saw a bunch of really interesting things around, um, yeah, like values, um, sexual values, self-esteem. And I think it's because the pandemic, like, really, I mean, it perpetuated, how do I want to articulate this? It was like for some I saw like am I going to continue to feel powerless, or how can I like reinstate power back into myself? How can I, help other people do it, I don't know. It was really interesting. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, I mean, what popped in my mind when you were saying that is the whole thing where it's like, well, Pluto Capricorn is trines that polarity of Taurus, and so I mean, in a way, the pandemic was this catalyst to kind of force the Pluto Scorpio generation to go to the Taurus polarity point, which is very much, I mean, I guess like I kind of think of it as like, like the Scorpio is like you want to connect with something outside yourself, and then the Taurus is like you're going into yourself. And so
Mhm.
kind of like raises the question of like how did different people handle this evolutionary pressure that kind of was like forcing them to go to this polarity to do their Taurus to internalize,
Mhm.
um and like you know it like
Yeah, it was, I think it was a time for a lot of Pluto and Scorpios to understand what their values were, and like there is a humanitarian aspect to Pluto and Scorpio, I feel like, because it goes back to like the shared resources. So, like, I had another friend at this time period who she couldn't do anything, but she had always been into cold cases. Her best friend had been, killed. And so during the pandemic, she set up a nonprofit and started working cold cases out of her bedroom on her bed, like here at, where I live. And it was because it was aligning with her values. She wanted to do something where she felt like, um, again, this goes back to that tarot card you pulled, something where she felt like she could empower herself, I think, and not just feel like she was sitting on the sidelines. It was like, what can I do during this time period? Kind of gave everyone um, a pause in order to, yeah, assimilate what they wanted their specific purpose to be at that time. Like it gave people a lot to think about, I think. Like, because so as humans, we're like, okay, but when this ends, like, what's it gonna be like? You had some of
Mhm.
the people who are like, we wanted to go back to how it was before the pandemic happened, and then you have other people that are like, what can I do during this time period? That way, whenever I can go out into the world, I can utilize what I've been doing. I'm not just, sitting here doing nothing. That's another thing that I saw.
Mhm. So is it kind of like also like if you're faced with this, like I mean it brought into consciousness like yeah, like how long are we gonna live? Kind of, like
Survival.
yeah, and so like I think that's what I'm getting is like then that's that piece that's just like well what really what's really meaningful for me in life, so that that
Mm,
push into the values of like what actually matters the most.
yeah, it was like because there is that trine between Pluto and Capricorn to the polarity point. So it's like, taking, I saw a lot of people taking like, um, it was like a metamorphosis thing. Like people were taking old trauma or things that had happened, and then they were understanding what their values were and aligning themselves to do some purposeful work, some societal work, that trine between Capricorn and Taurus. So it was like, yeah,
Hmm.
it also, I think for a lot of Pluto and Scorpios, it was kind of this dark night of the soul. And it's like, okay, so what am I going to do now? Like, and how can I, if I'm working on myself and I'm getting to the bottom of all of this and I actually have the time to do it, um, what am I going to do as a social function, something that could be socially relevant? How does it align with my values? I think that that's something that, I've seen a lot with the Pluto Scorpios.
Also, for a lot of them, then at some point around that time period, Pluto would have transited their Neptune in Capricorn, which also kind of ties to this theme of like, what's my ideal function in this society and world? Like, what really is meaningful work for me to do,
Hmm.
and how that ties back to the values.
Yeah, and I mean it goes with, if you're like the 89 to 93ers that have that Capricorn kind of stellium thing going on, you had Pluto transit over all of this. So I think it was like this time period of like, okay, like I went through hell and back. So what do I do with this now? So yeah. And it's either people did drugs, they committed suicide, or they decided like I'm gonna do something that could maybe inspire other people.
Yeah, yeah, wow.
So
Plus Scorpios.
heavy.
Yeah. Um, Anything more on Pluto Scorpios? You want to move on to the Pluto Libra generation?
Yeah, I think I'm good on Pluto Scorpio. I mean,
Right. I mean,
I
we could keep going, of course. Yeah.
totally. I think I feel like that way about each one of these though. But for time's
Yeah.
sake, yeah, we can move on for sure.
For today. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Pluto Libras, I guess I'll get us started. That would be my generation. And like one of the things in evolutionary astrology we talk about with Libra, especially the Pluto Libras, is that it's probably the most extreme, a sign of extremes. And I felt like I really witnessed this within my generation. And like, I guess one of my thoughts was, okay, like there, I mean, it's different for all the Pluto Libras, but like at a very core level, this Pluto Libras like want to be liked, they want social harmony, and they want peace. And so then the question becomes like, what is the peer group that they're surrounded by that really matters in terms of like how they image themselves if they don't, if they're not in harmony with them, or if they don't have that approval, social approval. And of course, Pluto Capricorn squares Pluto Libra, so there's this inherent tension there within this whole experience. So yeah, I do kind of see that the pandemic kind of that was one of the themes that I saw with the Pluto Libra generation, was this certain like crisis. Crisis in action is the first quarter square. So it's like, how do like, how am I going to be in the world, when I mean, it does put that, again, it does put that pressure on the Aries polarity, is like, where do you stand on the issue? And a kind of Pluto Libra classic thing is like, well, I could see that point's valid and I could see that side's valid. And, like, it's kind of like, where are you going to fall on that? Like, should you be like double masking and going to this extreme, or like, are you like, like killing people because you're not wearing a mask? Are you like, like, it was a real crisis in consciousness, I think, for a lot of Pluto Libras. But the response, I think, for a lot of them was to go to an extreme that fit for them. Um, and then that also created social separation as part of that process. Um, yeah, so it was definitely I think it was very stressful for a lot of the Pluto Libras because there's this inherent deep desire for unity and peace and harmony, and then just kind of living through so much social turmoil. Like it does force the Pluto polarity of Aries, but also it's just like inherently uncomfortable. Um,
Yeah. I'm wondering, because I'm trying to think of the Pluto and Libras that I know. Actually, I think a lot with the Pluto and Libra that I'm recalling, like during this time period, it was definitely like it takes an extreme to counteract an extreme kind of dynamic. So like there's like I saw a lot of people's relationships end during this time that were Pluto Libra because it was like, they were stuck in a very structured reality during this time where they had to be in close proximity with someone, and like they're realizing the actual reality that's occurring, because they are stuck in close proximity. And so it's like, what do I do? Do I acquiesce? Do I mask? Do I abandon myself? Or, do I become my own authority and kind of find my own voice? Do I start asking and answering my questions even in a relational sense? And I do think that that's whenever it also pulls in the Aries dynamic, because I think what I saw was quite a few of them, and I could be overgeneralizing, correct me if I'm wrong, but I saw quite a few of them on some, whether it was relationships or not, they were having to learn how to, or refine, like, um, how to be responsible with their choices at this point in time so that extremes weren't continuously, perpetuated is the word I'm looking for.
mhm.
So I don't know if you saw that
That
or not.
that seems spot on. Yeah.
Okay. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm trying to think with all my Capricorn, I'm like, what's the direct experience that I've had with some of these souls? So, but
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a really interesting point because it again exacerbated this um the potential extremes for them. It's like, guess what? Like you're with these people all the time.
yes,
So like it did force that Aries polarity to come out. Um,
yes. It makes me think of, this is so Plutonian, but I think for a lot of them, whether it was like with social justice, with their relationships of all kinds, it was like a real shit or get off the pot moment? That's kind of like that's kind of crass, but that's what comes to mind. I feel like for a lot of the Pluto Libra generation.
mhm. Yeah, so like I mean, obviously, like Pluto Libras can be social chameleons in ways too. So it's an interesting piece. Like, um, one of my thoughts on it was like, well, for like in the United States, I mean, and all over the world, there seems to have been like a polarization of response to the pandemic of like what's our personal responsibility of, like should we mask or not? Like what's a social responsible action as you now go out in the world? And there's a certain part of the population that, is obviously like there's a whole spectrum, but like
It's the
but
divisiveness.
it created a little bit of this duality of the choice, even though there's a
Mhm.
whole spectrum of how you might go about it. And for those who were um, rejecting rejecting the, like, and I just had this whole thought of like, in a way, this is a larger theme and story, but there's kind of like this, like, I think for a lot of people, it felt like an imposed reality upon them. Like, this isn't true. Like, you're trying to control my freedom and my life. Um, but like, because that is like a really strong narrative for a lot of people, if those are your people and you have a Pluto Libra, like, are you more inclined to go with their story or their narrative, like, and then there's this inherent tension wherever you go because um, you're totally aware of which narrative you do or don't harmonize with, and like how you're now perceived socially, like um, because you might be, like not abiding by whatever that social norm is.
Hmm.
And like social norms is very like Capricorn Libra combination theme. Um,
The social expectations too, you
yes,
know?
yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, that this like greater crisis of the social expectations was
Mhm.
really brought up, especially for the Pluto Libras, I think, more so.
Yeah. Well, and it makes me think, so during this time period, um, for some of them, wasn't Neptune in conjunct their Pluto? So it was like, the crisis of having to face the actual reality, right? On some type of level, the actual truth of something. Or crisis could be perpetuated from the imbalances of trying to deny reality.
Hmm.
So I wonder if you have anything to say about that, actually, like the Neptune in conjunct Pluto during that time.
Gosh, I mean, I guess my first thought was just this larger Neptune and Pisces theme of like, are we gonna really be conscious of what's going on, or are we just gonna escape it? Because like obviously like escapism was massive during pandemic and drug use as coping mechanism, alcohol, substance use, let's just say substance use.
Yeah.
Like we know that it's really sad what's going on and that the amount of people that like have gotten like really messed up, and maybe to the point where like they're not going to be able to like come back to like an integrated quote unquote normal life,
Mhm.
so like yeah, we are bearing witness to this reality. um and so also with that dynamic, I think like it's tricky because there's this whole thing of like Neptune and Pisces, like who's, and then you combine this Capricorn theme of like who's responsible, who do we blame for this? So like scapegoating's
Scapegoat. Yeah, that's what I was
like
thinking.
rampant. Um, so then it kind of really comes back to like, well, where is each individual within their own consciousness and how, because like back to your question, I think it's like can we sit with and like see, hold space for what's really hard to bear witness to, and still like choose a path of being conscious about moving
Mhm.
forward. It's not an easy thing to do. um and also like I don't think it's helpful to have judgment around what happens because it's like each individual's like did what they are gonna do, did, and then we all we can do is go from the moment. And it's like if you like make the choice to use substances for the rest of your life, you make that choice. Like it's not like there's just the karma of what that means, and that you eventually like learn from that, and it's like not even like wrong. Like it's just like maybe even more of like that was necessary. That's like all you could do at that time. Like
Exhausted, especially. I feel
yeah.
like makes me think of this saying that I say a lot. And it's like, I think it puts it into perspective to not have judgment. Like, I always think of there's more than one way to get to Denny's. Like, everyone has to have whatever experience that they need to have in order to evolve. And so we can't judge it. You know what I'm saying? And yeah, there's more than one way to get to Denny's. So,
I mean, it's an interesting conversation, especially with like the whole Pluto Capricorn era, where there's probably like even more of this deeper impulse to judge,
yeah.
and define, and but yeah.
Well, I think
um,
we've seen like a lot of self-righteousness come out of it. You know what I'm saying? Which is totally Capricorn. And then well, this is kind of talking about Pluto Leo with that inconjunct. Then we saw a lot of like indignation that happened. You know what I'm saying during this time. Like I think I even heard, who was it? It was some political leader. He even used that word, and he's a Pluto and Leo. You know, and I was like, oh yeah, that fits the bill.
Can you speak to that a little bit, like the indignation, like what?
So indignation, to me, it's a Leo dynamic, but I feel like it's more of a Leo Capricorn dynamic. So it's when you feel like this annoyance, that, you know, you or wrongdoing, by someone else's actions or by the actions of a society at large or whatever. And so the indignation feels like, you know, that you're being slighted. And so it gets into this Leo dynamic of, you know, not feeling dignified, right? Like, you know, so yeah. Who was
Mm-hmm,
it who
mm-hmm.
said this? I actually feel like it might have been our last president who said that, you know, during this time whenever he was speaking about the pandemic. He was talking about feeling indignation.
Thank you.
Oh,
That's really
I
interesting. Yeah.
paused. Yeah. So, but like you can see there's like this crisis that comes from that too, of that
Mhm.
feeling. It's like, what do I do?
Yeah.
You know? So, yeah. This is just how I view it anyway.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and just um, I have one wrap-up thought on the Pluto Libras,
Yeah,
and
sorry.
maybe we'll move on. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of accentuate the fact that it like the Pluto square is, and like obviously like maybe talk about this another time, but like Pluto into Aquarius, even if it's just in the first degree, like that whole Pluto Scorpio generation energetically starts their Pluto square. And so that Pluto square, Pluto is, it's a, I mean, it'll take you down.
It's
Like
intense, is what you're
you're,
saying.
it's in a you're like, yeah, you are in a process. I mean, I like, you're in a Pluto process, like you don't really know until later. You're like, oh, okay. Like I
I feel
was
like
in
my whole
this,
life is just going to be one of those.
yeah.
But that's more geared towards my own natal chart, you know? It's
Yeah,
like, so, um, okay. So Pluto and Virgo.
Pluto Virgos, yeah.
Do you do you want to start?
Sure, sure. I mean, they would have had the first quarter trine by, aspect here. And then going back to the Seven of Wands card a little bit, like I kind of did see like the Pluto Virgo generation. Well, I mean, yeah, like you can see how like maybe like there's the um there's the negative side of maybe like creating like neuroses or like this kind of like hyper like paranoia of germs. Like yeah, there's that piece, but I think that there's a by and large there was a lot of the Pluto Virgos that again like with the Pluto Leos retiring or passing on, it was kind of like their time. It's been their time, I think, with Pluto and Cap to really step like finally like out of the shadows of the Pluto Leos and get to kind of be leaders themselves.
Hmm.
um and relative to like Pluto Virgo, like this whole idea that the soul desires to evolve through crisis, and then like here's a total crisis and there's a kind of a call to action, like there's a lot needed. I think a lot of those souls really stepped up and helped in ways, and then it fueled this deeper soul sense of their soul purpose and fulfilling a social responsibility. Obviously then there's the crisis of burnout, and then we had all these people like like I can't do this anymore. So, there's that piece that happened too. Um, yeah, those are some initial thoughts on the Pluto Virgos.
I'm trying to think. I know that I think for some of the Pluto Virgos that I've worked with during this time, it was a lot of them did actually have health issues that were like ignited though, like um
Hmm.
I saw like especially during the pandemic, which is really interesting. I saw a couple of them like get cancer diagnosis, but then it was really interesting what they were too like afraid to like go get their treatments or but they started doing more like natural things to, you know what I'm saying? And one of them that I'm
Hmm.
thinking about what this did for her during this time was she again going back to the seven of wands card, even through this kind of crisis she got into herbalism, right, which is totally like a Virgo thing, I feel like, and it was because she was trying to figure out how to prevent something like that from ever happening to her again. So I think it like gave a few of them the time to, especially like the Pluto Virgo conjunct Uranus, it gave them a time, the pause gave them a time to be more objective about what they wanted to do, what their social
Hmm.
function was going to be, I think.
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm trying to think, who do you, does anyone come to mind that was like a public person that had Pluto Virgo at this time? I'm putting you on the spot, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't have anyone right now. I will if somebody comes through. I'll.
Okay, sorry.
I mean, it's interesting because it's like Virgo's the humblest sign of the zodiac, and so there's also like I mean that's interesting because it like speaks to like I just feel like that a lot of those souls have just been like working hard this whole time behind the scenes and like yeah, maybe they even like haven't been acknowledged for what they've actually been doing. Um,
It makes me think of like, you know, I wonder who like the chemists were during the time of trying to figure out and what is it called? Like the shot for COVID, I'm having like a brain fart. But I'm like, I wonder if it was like these, like that's to me is like so Pluto, Virgo, conjunct Uranus during this time, behind the scenes, doing something scientific as a way to serve the whole. So I'm like, oh, I wonder who invented it, who came up with it, and it would be interesting to see if they were a Pluto and Virgo person. Because it's behind the scenes. I know that like a lot of people in um what state was this? I think it was Vermont during this time, that they were like the Pluto Virgo um kind of age demographic, if I recall. They were setting up um more, what is it? It wasn't a co-op or anything. It was more of like these little communities for people to like live off the land, right? And like to kind of serve people that were like homeless at the time. God, I'll look up the article because I'm pretty sure that the woman who was in the article was a Pluto Virgo woman, and it was kind of her thing that she wanted to do because she saw that there was a need for it in that community at the time, or it might have been New Hampshire. It was one of the East Coast. But this
hmm,
is whenever we saw like a lot of the progressive, I'm gonna, I can't say it right, progressivism. Is that correct?
I
Yeah.
think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. And when you first started speaking, I was like, oh yeah, the polarity is Pisces. So again, like this kind of pause, like obviously like Pluto Virgos could be, like kind of going, like the never-ending list, always working, and so kind of forced to go into that Pisces polarity to pause could also been this thing that facilitated evolution, which I thought you touched on there at the
Yeah.
beginning. Um, on the flip side of what you're sharing, the total opposite, like I think like one of the things I think about with the Virgo is like like in EA, we get into the whole psychology of Virgo and sadomasochism, and like on the masochistic end, like obviously it's just like there's always a need to improve and do better, but like on the sadistic pathology, there's this anger response to like I'm like not doing something right or something, I'm not perfect, or something's wrong with me. And I kind of saw that actually come out in that some of that generation with the whole like piece of like this element of a social judgment of like what you're doing is harming other people's lives. And so it almost like to me triggered this deeper like soul rage and anger. I mean, it got ugly. We know it got ugly. And I think like that was some of that was tied to um, some of these souls
Yeah.
response to feeling um, blamed for their actions that they didn't believe was true.
Well, and it makes me think of, especially because of that natural trine between Virgo and Capricorn, if some of them were scapegoated at this time period and like their anger came out from that as well, you know?
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, right. Scapegoating on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that I
Yeah.
mean, right, and that was part of the polarization too. Is like both sides were kind of like blaming the other side.
Yes.
It's been
I
a
mean, it was like very divisive. I mean, I feel like that was a period that really ignited a divisiveness that we see right now. Like
mhm.
the the time period of 2020 on now, it's like, well, gosh, now even, I mean, I could go down a whole rabbit hole with that, with how the nodes are right now, but like,
Yeah.
it's almost like yeah, it ignited it. It's not that it hasn't always been there, it's that it was exposed. Do you know what I'm saying?
Hmm, hmm.
In a bigger way.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, maybe we'll have another talk and go into this more. One of the things that we were kind of talking about ahead of this is like the Saturn Pluto conjunction in January 12th, 2020, that, kind of is like this great conjunction that began the pandemic, so to speak. And I was just sharing with you, like, Jeffrey Wolf Green says Pluto induces polarization. And so like one of my points is like the fact that that conjunction was on the south node of Pluto, um, and it's in Capricorn, and then it kicks off this whole period of polarization of society.
Mhm.
Um, but like, yeah, like I think what you're saying is true. Like it was already there, like the
Yeah.
roots of racism, the roots of oppression, patriarchy, of all the isms that are already in the consciousness that like so like this whole idea that the pandemic kind of kicked off with exposing the roots of all of these things in 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 our consciousness that we had to look at then, where like uh, is an example of like years ago before the pandemic, my friend lost her cat, and she was like going around to all the neighbors to see if they'd seen her cat. And she went a couple doors down, and this in this person's garage they had a huge swastika, and so she was like, "Whoa! I did not expect to see that." And there's this kind of this piece of like certain things aren't socially allowed, but like they're still there, and like they're still going on in people's psyches and their realities playing out. And so yeah, we saw this obviously this emboldening of coming out of the roots of all this, the
Yeah.
exposure of it. um and I like obviously like that's like a whole larger piece that posed a lot of challenge for in so many different ways. And this other element to the whole thing is the polarization, but like you're saying, it's connected to this root of something that was already there, that's like wanting to be like let's look
Yeah.
get deep into this.
It's Yeah, I mean, I think with that conjunction, it was like forcing us and exposing how we've structured societies. And it's like, you know, sometimes like I know Pisces can be like what's hidden, but like I feel like with Pluto, Scorpio, sometimes that's like not wanting to be exposed, right? It's like the manipulations, you know, so I think that even that conjunction really kicked off this time period of in order to like have a full breakdown of how we've structured society or our all of our social constructs at first had to be really exposed, right? Like it was like in a true Platonian way. It was like, yeah, no, like you could be walking around and not know that your neighbor has that, and like now it's in your face because it is there's something that's wanting to be changed, you know. And so I do, and then it's interesting to think that that happened, and then everything that's been going on, and now we have like Saturn and Pisces that's like, okay, well, like let's wrap this up and like, let's dissolve how we've structured all of this. It's been exposed. How much more of this needs to be exposed for like you humans to get it? It's kind of the way that I see it. But yeah, I always wonder if I make sense when I'm talking.
No,
Sorry.
that all made sense. Yeah, I
Okay,
love it. I
cool.
love it. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a little rabbit hole we went on from the Pluto Virgos.
Yeah, sorry.
Some of the no, I love rabbit holes.
Same.
But yeah, I mean, it's a great conversation because, like I think that there's this piece of like, yeah, there's no like blanket statement we can make, and I think one of the things that we're doing in this conversation is we're showing that there is a true diversity of experiences but then like within each generation there's these larger, variety of themes.
Social
Um,
causes. Yeah.
and so yeah, well, we're want to wrap up and get into Pluto Leos for a minute here and
Sure. Perfect.
save the best for last. Yeah, I know.
Right.
I can't help but make Pluto Leo jokes, but I do like. There's so many Pluto Leo souls that are so dear to my heart, and I love them. But I tend to pick on them a little bit too. But
One of my favorites is Sue, you know? So,
love Sue.
yes.
Yeah, so I mean, like I was saying earlier, I think just like the natural inconjunct from Capricorn back to Leo, I think the Pluto generation was already going through a crisis of literally like Capricorn, like you have a finite amount of time left in your life. How are you going to live?
Mhm.
And then the pandemic hits, and that just hits home even more. It just kind of blows up that crises,
Yeah.
that gibbous inconjunct, and so yeah, a lot of them retired, but like it was interesting. Like I know some that um, I have someone close to me that retired and they were in a position of a public health role, not like in more of like a management administrative way, but they were needed still. So they kind of like came out of like retirement and helped the transition. So I actually saw a lot of that with the Pluto Leos of like they're like trying to retire, but also they have a whole legacy. Like they've been like doing this thing. They still need to be like a mentor and pass on the baton. And so like then they're kind of doing that part-time thing or like figuring out a way to not leave people high and dry because they've been like, you know, doing their thing for so long.
Yeah.
Interesting dynamic.
Well, and I think that that is like part of the Pluto Leo generation that I've seen just in general is like they don't want to not work. Like they don't know how, like what like it challenges their reality way too much. Like what would life look like if I wasn't working?
Mhm.
And then it's really interesting to think like this time period during the pandemic kicked off the election, and I mean I'm not trying to get into politics or anything like that, but here we have like two Pluto Leos, the oldest like presidents ever, and it's like they just don't want to like give it up, so
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I it it fits the bill.
Yeah, I heard a story of somebody who was, a pilot and they retired during the pandemic, and then there was a shortage of pilots, and so like they went back to work, and
Mhm.
like so there's kind of that sense of right, like that. I mean, like to be full of one's purpose in life, and have it if it's connected to one's work,
Mm-hmm.
for that soul, like that's like wind in the sails. So like then you retire. I mean, that's not true for all the Pluto Leos, but for some of them, especially if you see like a strong, like, like a work dynamic in the chart, maybe Pluto is in the fourth or 10th, or, or I don't know, just like it was really meaningful to come back and be like a really significant help in a time of need. Um,
Yeah. I, what did you just say that I was going to touch on? Keep going, because it'll come back to me.
okay.
Things come and go. Sorry. It's like the 80 perpetual ADHD brain, you know? So,
um, yeah, I mean,
oh,
it,
I was I was thinking about this and you touched on it is, you know, a lot of them came out of retirement in order to help, but I feel like with that in conjunct that was happening with that generation, like it's even deeper layers of, yes, I think for some of them, like you said, if they have like a fourth house, 10th house, axis thing being fired off, um, to go back to work. But it's like, I'm wondering if for some of them, because I've seen it, I think just a handful that I'm recalling, that it was like during this time period, it also on the flip side of what you're talking about gave them time to like get into some type of hobby or something that they had never been able, because they were always working, right? Because
mhm,
we're thinking about like they were raised by the Pluto and Cancer generation, and so like their morals and ethics and everything. I think that this was like a time period for some of them to, the crisis was like, what do I do with all of this time, especially during a pandemic? And so I think for um a good chunk of them, they were figuring out like, well, what really speaks to like what feels fun to me, what feels like, I could enjoy like now that I have all of this time. You know what I'm saying? Like
yeah.
I'm thinking of one who went into like ranching that I know. Like he retired and he had always wanted to do ranching, and so that's what he did. And he had the time to do it, during this time period, because what else are you gonna do? And it was a way to be out in the open, so land. But yeah.
hmm Yeah, like yeah, and I'm thankful for a lot of the volunteer work and plugging back in. And I mean, I got
Mhm.
like a whole bunch of thoughts coming to me, but um, one last thought. Like my dad's a Pluto Leo in the 12th, and um, like one of the things that I noticed is like that polarity, the sixth house. Like he's retired now, but like most of his life is just focused on service and helping people, and it's like I like it's one of the things I'm really just like look at him and I'm just like, well, one, like it's like, well, yeah, it's like clearly like that's your soul's evolutionary path. You're doing what you're here to do, and also like really, like that just warms my heart that um, that's like what he does with his life. And um,
Yeah.
but the example of house placement and polarity.
Yeah, it was making me think of my own dad's chart because I mean, my parents, I was a surprise baby. So my parents are, in their 70s. So, but they're definitely part of that generation. And yeah, I mean, even with them, what I saw like definitely fits the bill. It's like it's almost like that in conjunct, the crisis for I think some of them was like, yeah, we're realizing that like death and it kind of becomes more stark. Like I'm aging, all of these things. And so I think for a lot of them it was like, what is the thing that maybe I haven't like tied up loose ends on a soul level of what I'm
Hmm
wanting to self actualize? You know what I'm saying?
hmm
Um, so yeah, because I mean, I would love to give examples, but the ones I know, I don't think I should because they're pretty personal, but not to me, but I know that they wouldn't appreciate it. But yeah, it really makes me think of that, like that is the crisis of like, now I have this free time. So it's like, what didn't I get to do that really like speaks to like joy, for me. And for some people, I do think it was service work. So
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. One other theme on the Pluto Leo generation too is like that being the elder generation now, and them growing up in a time that was really different than the present. I definitely see more of like a romanticization of like a like the way things used to be kind of thing. And then, like especially like the pandemic kind of really like was like, can we just like go back to like how things were? And
Hmm.
like there's not going back, like it's just going to keep changing. But like as the I mean, I experienced that myself as the world changes, more and more of like, yeah, I remember when like I didn't carry this like phone around. I mean, I could make a choice not to do that, but like, it's like
Yeah.
how did we even like meet up and like know people? Like what did it like how did that even happen? It's like trying to
We
remember
called them and we told them, meet at this spot. I'll see you at
like
like, and you just crossed your fingers and hoped that they would be there. I mean, I remember doing that like with friends, like, let's meet at the field at da 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 time. And it's like, I can remember being like, well, I hope that they meet me because I'm walking over there, you know?
yeah. Yeah. I think like too like Leo, obviously, like there's a playfulness to life that was part of that Pluto Capricorn crisis. Like Pluto
Hmm.
Capricorn's not that playful really, like so. And then the pandemic, like on one hand, it like felt like it made it even less like that dynamic of like actually like having fun and enjoying life. But on the other hand, it opened up new opportunities to do
Hmm.
their polarity, connect with people, community over the internet. And so there was like this other opening up of like, oh, actually this is different, but this is yeah.
I will speak because that made me think. So I like this really fits that bill. Like, so my mom had lost her husband, my stepdad, right before the pandemic. And she was like kind of a hermit for a while. Like, she's Pluto Leo. But during the pandemic, she started to want to connect and have community. And so she was getting on. I remember she was like online dating for her age. And like, she was meeting friends and like, I don't, and it also, what it did was it, what the polarity is for her, what I saw was that, and I also think that this speaks to that in conjunct was like the things that she had judgment around, like specific types of people, right? Um, my mom's more consensus. During this time period, I saw the interactions that she was having with other people that like my mom's a retired attorney and she started hanging out with like a woman who is a trucker and runs a trucking school. Like it was like completely different than I would have
Hmm.
never thought my mom would have done that. And so I think it like challenged her own judgments and opened her up to more of that polarity point. It gave time to reflect and to think. And I think a lot for the Pluto Leo generation with that in conjunct with Pluto Capricorn was a time about reflecting. Like, okay, it like really forced them, whether it be people around me are dying or I have health issues, or I'm alone. It kind of, I think for some of them, it helped them to definitely reflect in order to objectify for sure.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm. Yeah, well said. Yep. Thank you for adding that.
yeah, no problem.
Yeah, it's great to get into the polarity on each of these because it's interesting. Like I actually hadn't thought that thoroughly through, but as we've gone through today, kind of realizing how, I mean, Pluto is all about triggering evolution, and so like we can see, like how that polarity was activated for each of the generations. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
opportunity to evolve.
I love how that organically fell into place for this conversation, for sure.
Yeah, me too. Well, thank you so much for being here today with me and having this talk. And
I had
yeah,
fun. I'll do
thank you.
it
Thank you.
whenever you want me to. I'll come on here. It was fun. Um, hopefully I didn't go down too many rabbit holes because I can. I like my little, ninth house stuff wants to be like, I don't know, go off in some other realm. So
It's great. Tangents and stories are perfect. I loved it. So yeah,
awesome. Well, I
yeah,
really had fun. So thank you for asking me.
yeah. Well, would love to do more together. So yeah.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, thanks for listening if you're out there listening. And until next time, fare thee well.